Hi again, everybody. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 4 and about the reading strategies, teaching them, and also the framework, which will be the mini lesson. So you should have already read Chapter 4 by now, or at least the page numbers that I required of you. And in the vignette at the very first of the chapter, it's really interesting to talk about the teaching strategies and how what teachers believe really does influence their practices. And so Laura Robb, who's the author of our textbook, had been going to the school to do professional development, and the teachers were still asking her questions about popcorn reading. And so if you don't understand popcorn reading, it's just going in order, different students reading one paragraph at a time or a little section at a time and just taking turns. And so she made a point to go back and talk about best practices. Why do we know that popcorn reading is not the best way to teach? One reason is because it's practicing skills in isolation. In other words, all these things we've been talking about, making connections. Students need to have a deep connection to things that they're reading and talking about. And popcorn reading, there's no connection. It's apart from the materials that students read regularly, maybe in their independent reading, and does not guarantee that connection. Also, taking turns reading the same text aloud actually makes some students really anxious. And since everybody is on the same text, then a lot of it will be at a frustration level for several students in your class. And so it's a bad recipe for embarrassment, and just, middle school students just cannot handle that. It's a time of development anyway, and so it's really horrible to put them on the spot like that. And then the last one is taking turns reading out loud is not a form of instruction. In other words, just because they are reading the words does not mean you are instructing them about how to understand, how to comprehend. And so the last thing she said, which I think is so valuable, is that popcorn reading is not an authentic literacy experience because no one outside of school reads that way. Seriously, we need to give students the tools that they are going to use throughout their lives, just not for that class that you're teaching, but give them some strategies so that they will be able to utilize in other areas of their lives and all throughout their life. So it's really important to reflect on your own reading life, so you can think about the things that you do as a reader. And I keep talking about this in class. By this time you'll know, because it is so important to know yourself in this way. And so I want you to go back to your textbook, even if you've read the chapter already, and go through and look at page 100 and look at all those bullet points of how Dr. Robb talked about herself as a reader. And she's noticed these things along the way. She didn't notice them all at first. And so we're going to do a little activity in class that kind of goes through and asks you some questions about yourself, so you can get to know yourself better. So another thing I want you to think about right now, and we'll talk about more in class, is how did you learn to read? Think back when you were in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, throughout the lower elementary classrooms. Did you learn to read with worksheets and book reports, or did you learn to read with strategies and independent reading books? Think about that, because your beliefs about reading have a lot to do with how you were taught to read. And so you might have to overcome some of those things that aren't considered best practices anymore, so you can become a successful reading teacher. So what's the difference between skills and strategies? If you look in your book on page 101, the author goes through and talks about the differences, but I just kind of picked out some important differences. So skills are very isolated. You can think of worksheets. There's no connection to authentic reading happening, and usually that student does not extend the skill that they learned into what they're doing. So they just have one specific application. So it's very encapsulated into that one worksheet or one workbook. Strategies, on the other hand, are taught, they're tools that are given to students to use in lots of different applications across different kinds of text. So it also, one of the differences is that there is a plan for learning. So you're thinking about what you're doing, you're thinking about the text, but also using that process in other ways. Also, it increases students' self-awareness and how they think, so they can apply it in other areas. And you can actually switch out those strategies depending on what you need. You know, when you practice a skill with a worksheet, then that is the only place you do that. You don't put that skill on another worksheet that's different. But with strategies, you can change along the way. Also, there is not a sequential list. With skills, usually in like a basal or an anthology, you will have a sequence to when you learn certain things, but with strategies, you learn them when you need them. So that's why you have to pay attention to your students. So the reading strategies, let's get to the meat of the rest of the class. We will focus a lot on the 3 different areas in reading strategies: before, during, and after reading. It starts on page 104. There's a chart there, and this is where I took the strategies that you will be signing up for with your reading strategy presentation, or actually you probably already signed up for them. But just as an overview, the before reading strategies focus on activating prior knowledge. So you want to know what your students know before you start teaching them some new information. It goes back to that brain research and schema theory that we've all learned about for a long time now. And so you need to know what they know so you know where to go with your lesson. Set the purpose for reading and making predictions. So all of those things deal with the prior knowledge that students have. The during reading strategies, these are those things that help a student understand as they are reading. So they're making connections, they are constructing new meaning, but also helping them to know what to do to fix up when they have comprehension difficulties. So if they get to the end of a paragraph and they have no clue what they read or can't remember anything, what do they need to do then? How do they fix that? And then the last group of strategies focus on what students do after they read, so to extend their learning, not just close the book and go on to the next one, but what do they really, what can they do to extend that learning? It helps them enlarge their knowledge base. They can learn how to apply that same strategy in a novel situation or a new book, a new situation, a new text. So the next 3 chapters after this deal with that, and you guys will be presenting to us in class too. But the big framework that you need to know is called the strategy lesson framework, and actually Dr. Rob calls it mini lessons throughout the book, and that's what you're going to do. You are not going to do a full-blown lesson plan with all of the stuff that you maybe have done before in another class. We're going to kind of zero in and focus on the mini lesson that is focused on the strategy that you're going to teach. So mini lessons are done in short time frames, and ours are going to be done in 10 to 15 minutes. And so you have to pack a whole lot of information into a short time and allow students to get to practice as well. In this short time frame, students will see you as an expert reader practice in front of them. And I cannot stress this enough, that you have to think aloud in front of somebody. And that is very uncomfortable at first, I'll just let you know. Sometimes it's hard to know what to focus on with your thinking, but you do have to go in there with a plan. And so each mini lesson generally includes thinking aloud, documenting your thoughts and questions. In other words, you are not just going to be talking to your students, because sometimes it's hard for them to grab on to what you're talking about. So you're going to document those things on an anchor chart, which will keep that learning there so students can then refer back to it when they're trying to apply the strategy in their own reading and in their own lessons. It also includes interactions with students. So even though you're thinking aloud, they still can have the opportunity to ask questions. You will actually ask them for their observations. In other words, you might say, what did you just see me do? And so you're going to understand their how they know what to do or know how to apply the strategy because of those interactions. You might also have students turn and talk to each other about what they saw you doing. And then the last part would be giving students time and support to try it. So you're going to let them watch you, let them talk about it, and then let them try it. And this might be a part where you have them try it in pairs. You might have them try it in their independent reading. And then the support to try it will come in conferences or a little bit later. The lesson strategy lesson framework is on page 137, which is not in this chapter, which I think is kind of odd. But this is the framework that we're going to use for our mini lessons. So it's linked within that. So if you will look at this and be ready for us to talk about it, we will talk about this in class as well. So you just got to click on that link. Okay. So how do you know which mini lessons to teach and in what order? Well, this is kind of uncomfortable for some people, but you really determine what to teach according to the student's needs. So think back to the other chapters when we were talking about doing all this get to know you assessment, doing observations, doing little reading activities, watching students as they interact. All of those things, even those tests and benchmark assessments at the first of the year will help you get to know what your students need. But Laura Robb actually has had so many people ask her what to teach that she's come up with a list of things that she goes ahead and teaches yearly because they always seem to be needed. And so a mini lesson on deciding whether or not to abandon a book. This is important because you should not always finish every book you start. It might be too hard, it might be uninteresting, it might be offensive or inappropriate, and so you need to teach kids when it's okay to just abandon that book and go on. Also, finding specific details from a text to support an inference. Think back to the Common Core. That's hugely important there. Organizing a short essay. That's a compare and contrast. Mood, identifying themes, knowing which details are important, which that's a reading strategy, the determining importance. Writing and questioning, understanding the form of journal entries, and then connecting books to other things. And so those are just some that she's found every year she needs to teach. Some suggestions to make your mini lesson work. These are really important. Use some way to document your thinking, chart paper, smartboard, Google Doc in front of the students if you have somebody who wants to type or you do it. Use short text for modeling. In other words, you cannot read a novel and do a reading strategy in a mini lesson. It's just not possible. So if you do newspaper clippings or you do articles off the internet, you do something that's really interesting to them, or you might do, one page out of a novel, but keep it short. Encourage students to jot down questions. This is really important. They need to be able to document their thinking. You might give them a sticky note. I've seen some teachers use a back channel called Today's Meet or something like that to where they actually text it in. And also you have to use a think aloud and write on that chart. Be real. You need to share some negative feelings or frustrating things as you think aloud too, because they need to know that teachers go through that as well. And then make it a point to respond to your students' questions. There are a couple of benefits of thinking aloud. It's a modeling tool. Students can actually emulate that. If you only tell them what to do, they might not understand what you're talking about. Also, they see that good readers aren't always fast readers. Lots of kids think that good readers read fast and know all the words, and that's their definition of a good reader, but you can tell them and show them otherwise. It gives them permission to slow down. It also shows that you need to slow down to monitor your thinking. Then the last thing is you need to be able to have guided practice after your mini lesson. Just like we were talking about before, students need to be able to practice. So you could have everybody practice in the same text, and it needs to be at a level that your least proficient reader can be successful in practice. Or you could have the students practice in their own independent reading book, so everybody has a different book. And that way you can circulate and chat with students about their application of the reading strategy, and it gives them that support to try that new strategy. Think back to the reading workshop video that we talked about, and that teacher did exactly that. And so that concludes this video about Chapter 4, and we'll do lots of interesting activities in class to kind of extend this further.